We are so happy to see each of you. We've got a tremendous crowd with us this morning, a wonderful number, and we're glad that you are here. We have some visitors with us. We're thankful for that. We invite you to come back at any time. You're always welcome here at Lower Paw Paw. We have Anthony with us this morning. Now, Anthony, as you noticed, didn't come in the door by himself like he normally does, but rather he has a friend with him here today. I have not met Renee, right? But we have talked back and forth on social media a little bit, which ought to scare Anthony to death. But we're going to spend some time so she gets to meet the full Tom and understand why the rest of the Tuckers act the way that they did. But we're certainly glad that they are here, and your dad is, of course, in our prayers. We want to continue. We're going to start a new lesson today. But we want to continue this idea of sharing lessons that are not only for those who are new of the congregation, not only our new converts, but really lessons that we need to hear no matter how old or young we might be in the Lord's church. Because there are some things we need to understand. We talked about baptism. Baptism is so much misunderstood and so misquoted that we needed to study to know exactly what the Bible has to say. The same thing is true with the subject that we're going to introduce here today. It is not so much misunderstood, but really is most likely not even known. But yet it is a responsibility of each and every Christian, no matter how old or how young they might be in the faith. And so we're going to introduce that subject here this morning, and then when I come back here in 2 weeks, we'll continue this particular study. Someone once said, in fact, I believe it's called an old wives' tale, but someone once said, nobody is perfect. Nobody is perfect. Now, I'm sure that all of us at one time or another has heard that particular saying. Perhaps we've even said that a few times in our life. But is it really a wise tale? Well, friends, the fact of the matter is, it's not very wise at all. In fact, it is not true at all. When we say nobody is perfect, we're really, in a sense, saying that nobody who ever lived is perfect. They're just not. And nobody who will ever live is not going to be perfect. But the fact of the matter is, that is simply not true, isn't it? Because we all know that there is one who did live and still is perfect. And I'm sure that many of us know who that is. But for those who might be new to the faith and not really sure what the answer might be, we'll share that with you here in just a minute. But there is one, and still is one, who is perfect. And you know what? That phrase, or that saying, nobody is perfect, is also not true spiritually. Because there are those who have reached a spiritual perfection in the sight of God. And you can reach a spiritual perfection in the sight of God. And that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to introduce that idea. But let's begin by first of all answering that question that we asked it. And that is, who was and still is perfect? Well, I'm sure many of us know the answer to that question to be Jesus. But for the benefit of those who may not know, let's take a look at a couple of passages. Let's turn first of all in the book of Hebrews. In the book of Hebrews. And let's notice what I believe to be the Apostle Paul. What the Apostle Paul has to say in Hebrews, the 4th chapter, and especially in verse 15. But let's jump back up a few verses to verse 13. Now, once again, I'm going to continue to read from the New King James Version of the Bible. Here after a bit, we're going to jump back to the King James for just a couple of minutes. But let's read from the New King James Version of the Bible. Let's begin in verse 13. Hebrews, the 4th chapter. Everybody there? All right. Let's begin in verse 13. And there is no creature hidden from his sight, but all things are naked and open to the eyes of him to whom we must give account. Seeing then that we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Now let's just stop there for a minute. Here the apostle is teaching us that you and I have a high priest. And he even teaches us or names who that high priest is. That high priest is Jesus Christ. So let's read that verse once again. Seeing then that we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. And so Christ is our high priest. Verse 15. For we do not have a high priest who, Jesus Christ. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weakness, but was in all points tempted like as we. But what's the last part of the verse? Yet without sin. Here Paul teaches us very plainly that Jesus was perfect. He was without sin. But let's not stop there. Let's turn to 1 Peter. Let's turn to 1 Peter. 1 Peter chapter 2. And let's notice what Peter writes in verses 21 and 22. 1 Peter chapter 2, 21 and 22. All right, beginning in verse 21. For to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that we should follow in his steps. Verse 22. Who committed no sin, neither was deceit, or as we read in the King James Version, neither was guile found in his mouth. Now both of these passages is teaching us that Christ was perfect in the sight of God. Christ was without sin. But notice how complete his perfection was. In verse 22, which by the way is from Isaiah, I believe it's the 53rd chapter, but don't hold that to me, it is the book of Isaiah. Isaiah tells us that there was almost the exact same. He had no sin, and there was no guile found in his mouth. Prophecy, I believe, concerning Jesus. Peter repeats that prophecy here. Notice that there was no sin found in him, but also we're told there is no guile found in his mouth. Now what is meant by that? There is no guile. Now I'm going to share with you what the Easy English says here in just a minute. But the word guile in the language of the New Testament means a decoy. A decoy. Now there's some more of that definition we'll share with you in just a minute. A decoy. But as I got to thinking about that, we have a lot of hunters here. And so we all understand the idea of a decoy. I can remember my father-in-law many years ago when they lived up in Rootstown, Ohio, up around Ravenna. I was just talking to Joshua about this just the other day. He wanted to get geese into his yard. Now Dave wants to get them out of his yard. But my father-in-law wanted geese to fly into his yard. And so what did he do? Well, we all seen them years ago. The wind blows it, puffs it up, and flips it around. Those geese, that was a decoy. And so he would put that decoy out there in his yard to try to get geese to come in. Those of us who are hunters, we use decoys to lure whatever we're hunting into that dangerous area where we hope to shoot it. Right? A decoy is something that leads someone or something into a dangerous situation. So what's Peter here telling us? Peter is telling us that Jesus' words had no such decoy. His words were not used to lure people into a dangerous situation. That word guile not only means decoy, but its primary meaning in the original language is that Christ did not have sin in his words. He spoke truthfully. So notice his perfection here and how complete his perfection was. We're not only told here by Peter that he had, as we read in verse 22, that he committed no sin. There was no sin in his life. But we're also being told here by the Apostle Peter that there was no decoy, there was no trickery, there was no deceit in the words that he spoke. He, in other words, told the truth. You know how often he told the truth? All the time. All the time. Notice the completeness of his perfection. He was perfect in his deeds, and he was perfect in his words. There was no sin in his actions. There was no sin in the things that he had to say. His perfection was complete. These two passages alone show us that Jesus was indeed perfect. But I tell you what, they're not the only two passages that teach us this important fact. So let's notice two more passages very, very quickly. Let's go back to the book of Hebrews. And this time, let's go to Hebrews, the 7th chapter. We're going once again to the New King James Version of the Bible. Oh, by the way, I said I'd share the Bible, or the Easy English Version. The Easy English Version, back in 1 Peter. 1 Peter chapter 2 reads like this, 21-22. God has chosen that you should be patient like this. Christ had trouble and pain on your behalf. And he is the person who should copy, that you should copy. You should do the same thing, do the same kind of things Christ did. The Bible said this, verse 22. He never did anything that was wrong, and he never said anything that was not true. There was no sin in his deeds. There was no sin in his words. He was complete in his perfection. And there are other passages that teach that Jesus was perfect. Hebrews chapter 7. Let's read verses 22 and 25 and 26. 25 and 26. And this is from the New King James Version of the Bible, beginning in verse 25. Therefore he is also able to save to the uttermost those who come to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. And such a high priest was fitting for us. Now remember, who's our high priest? Hebrews chapter 4. Jesus is our high priest. For such a high priest was fitting for us, who is holy, harmless, undefiled, separated from sinners, and has become higher than the heavens. Notice three things. Holy, harmless, and undefiled. The word holy means undefiled by sin. There was no sin in his life. That word harmless in the language New Testament means to be free from guilt, or in other words, to be innocent. There was no sin in his life. And that word undefiled in the original language means to be unsoiled or to be pure. He was holy, harmless, and undefiled. He had no sin in his life. Let's turn now to 1 John. The 1 John chapter 3. 1 John chapter 3. And now let's notice what John has to say. He's once again continuing to talk. We're talking here about Christ. Let's see what John has to say, beginning in verse 1 of chapter 3. 1 John chapter 3. Behold, what manner of love the Father has bestowed on us, that we should be called children of God. Therefore the world does not know us, because it did not know him. Okay, now let's stop here for just a minute. We're going to have several pronouns here in the next few verses. Him and he. Who are we talking about? Well, at first you might think, well, him is referring back to God, but no, not really. Him is referring back to Son in the chapter before this. S-O-N. Son in verse 24 and verse 23 and verse 22. And we find out that Son also in verse 22 of chapter 2 is referring to Jesus the Christ. And so him in chapter 3 and verse 1 is referring to Jesus. Let's go on. Verse 2. Beloved, now we are children of God, and it is yet and has not yet been revealed what we shall be like. But we know that when He, the Son, is revealed, we shall be like Him, the Son. For we shall see Him, the Son, I think you get the idea, as He is. And everyone who has said this hope, and everyone who has this hope in Him purifies himself, just as He is pure. Just as He is pure. Pure here means to be pure from fault. He had no fault in His life. He had no sin in His life. But let's continue on. Verse 4. Whosoever commits sin also commits lawlessness, and sin is lawlessness. And you know that He was manifest to take away our sins, and in Him there is no sin. And in Him, the Son, chapter 2, there is no sin. Jesus truly lived a completely perfect life. He was perfect in that there was no sin in His deeds. He was perfect in that there was no sin in His words. He was completely perfect. But now let's talk about you and I. Let's talk about you and I. Because you and I, friends, and I don't mean to offend you, you and I make mistakes. Right? We have heard Dave say many times, that's the first mistake I've made since the last one. You know I make jokes about that all the time. It's the first mistake I've made since the last one. But you know what he's actually saying? He's actually saying Dave Miller is not perfect. Not one of us is perfect in that way. We all make mistakes. But here's the thing that we need to understand. And please don't get confused. And if you do get confused, that's all right. We're going to try to help you through this. We're going to try our best to help you through it. Please understand that even though we are a mistake-filled people, we can reach perfection in the sight of God. Now, once again, please understand, we're not talking about Christ. Christ is up here. But you and I are to be striving for it. We're to be reaching for that perfection. But you and I can be perfect in the sight of God. Perfect in the sight of God. Perfect in the sight of God like Noah. Perfect in the sight of God like Job. Perfect in the sight of God like so many others. We can reach that perfection. Okay, well, what are you talking about, Tom? We can reach that perfection. We can't be perfect like Christ, but we can reach a perfection in the sight of God? Yes. In fact, that is something that the Apostle Paul teaches us, I believe quite plainly, that we can reach a perfection in the sight of God. Let's turn here now. I told you we was going to jump to the King James, and that's what we're going to do. We're going to jump to the King James for just a minute, but we're also going to go back to the New King James. King James. Let's go to Philippians. Philippians, the 3rd chapter. And let's notice what we're told in verse 15. Now, what are we looking for? Well, we said just a moment ago that Paul actually teaches that we can reach a perfection. That we can reach a spiritual perfection in the sight of God. Paul teaches that each of us can. Dave can, Brian can, Joe can. All of us can reach that perfection. Notice what Paul writes in verse 15. Now here's the King James Version. In verse 15, let us, therefore. Now, as we're talking about this, kind of think in your mind, who in the world is us? Kind of think about that. Don't answer out loud, just kind of think about it. Verse 15. Let us therefore, as many as be perfect, be thus minded, and if in anything ye be otherwise minded, God shall reveal even this unto you. Now let's notice in particular the first part of the verse. Let us therefore be as many as be perfect. Paul here is telling us that we can reach a certain perfection in the eyes of God. Now the first thing that we need to understand is what is meant here by perfect. What does perfect mean? Well, perfect, as it is written here, comes from the Greek word teleo, or teleos. And that word teleos, in the language in the New Testament, means very simply to reach an end, to reach the finish. And the primary meaning of teleos is to be grown up or to be mature. Paul here is telling us we can reach, every single one of us can reach a perfection. We can reach a maturity in the sight of God. We can all reach that maturity. In fact, he was indicating to us that there were those who already reached that maturity. We asked the question just a moment ago, or asked you to think about who was meant here by us. Well, who do you think is meant by us? Well, us. That would include to all the people to whom Paul was writing. And it would also include the one who was doing the writing. Okay, to who was Paul writing here in Philippians? Okay, he was writing to the Christians in the city of Philippi. Is he writing to you and I as well? Yes. We are included in the us. But also Paul is included in the us. Notice the next phrase in the verse. As many as be perfect. As many as be perfect. What does that indicate to us? That indicates to us that there were those who had already reached that perfection or that spiritual maturity in the eyes of God. We asked the question just a moment ago, who is us? Philippian Christians and the Apostle Paul. There were those in the church of Philippi who had already reached a spiritual perfection in the eyes of God, and Paul had reached that spiritual perfection. Paul had reached it. As many as be perfect. And just as those Philippian Christians and just as Paul reached that perfection, you and I can also reach a spiritual maturity in the eyes of God. We can reach a perfection in God's eyes. We can reach a perfection that Noah had, that Job had, that Paul had, that the Philippian Christians had. We can reach that perfection. But here's the question. How do we do it? How do we do it? What did Noah do? What did Job do? What did Paul do? What did the Philippian Christians do to reach that perfection? If we do the things they did, we too can be mature in the sight of God. What did Noah and Job do? That's the question that we'll look at the next time. We want to encourage you, friends, if you have yet to put on Christ in baptism, if you have yet to come in obedience to the gospel, we encourage you, friends, to do so here today. Everything is prepared to help you, and we are ready to help you. If you're part of the body but you have erred in your faith, friends, we also stand ready to pray for you. If we can help you in your obedience, why not come right now? Why, together we stand and we sing. Bring Christ your bride.